Welcome, everyone. We are excited to have you here today. Welcome to the 5th Annual Parent Network Workshop. We are pleased to have you join us for Megaphone Anyone, Using Your Values to Amplify Your Voice. Before we get started, I have some housekeeping notes for you. If you have comments, please use the Q&A feature that is part of Zoom. It's right there in the bottom in the menu bar. And you may have polls pop up. In fact, you will. You'll have two pop up during the session. They're anonymous, but please contribute so that our speakers have some feedback that they can work from. After the session, you're going to see a survey pop up about this session. Please take it. It helps give us feedback for what we are going to do this year and next. If you are an Idaho parent, our new Parent Network survey went live this week, and we're really excited to have you participate. You can find that survey on a link that will be emailed to you tomorrow, or you can go to idahoparentnetwork.org and take that survey right now. In the coming days, we are going to be posting a video of this session along with slides and resources. So make sure you check back on the idahoparentnetwork.org website, and you should be able to find everything there shortly. So with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce Janet Hecky and Jen Griffiths. They are both parents here in Idaho who have been advocating both in Idaho and nationally for years. We're very excited to have them here today. And with that, go ahead, ladies, take it away.
Thanks, Laura. I just want to start by just thanking each of you for taking the time today to join us. We are living in chaotic and noisy times, and I think that it's fitting with the topic of our presentation today to just acknowledge that. This is focused on using values in system work, but the reality is values have never been more important in grounding us, not only in any work that we do, but just individually. So it is my sincere hope today that you find some of what Janet and I have to share personally valuable, especially just during this time that we're in. So thank you for being here. Before we jump into our first section, I know that Laura just shared a poll. We have another one that we'd love for you to answer. In doing this presentation, we're going to kind of be layering different levels of information about values and the way we share it. It'll just kind of keep growing. And some of you may come with an idea of what your values are. Some of you may not have a clue. Some of you may use values daily in your work, others may not. So this next poll that Laura is going to share is just to give us an idea and also give you an idea of where values and your work with values currently lies in your life. So we're going to start today by identifying core values. That's discovering your megaphone. After that, we'll go into discovering the power of value-based decisions, turning up that volume, really amplifying your voice. And then the final section that we'll talk about is just some practical strategies for value-based advocacy. I call that limiting that audio feedback, especially when you're in the room with other people. So those are our learning objectives. That's where we're going to be headed. First section is just identifying those core values with some key questions that we're going to talk about. Our values come to us from a variety of places. Our values will show up in our lives as we're growing up through our culture, the family that we are in, the activities that we participate in. Those are the external forces that kind of create our values. We inherit a lot of the values that we that are part of who we are. We have that culture, both growing up and currently. We also have just family norms that will impact our values. Our religious, political, and society ideas, those will impact our values. And then there's internal forces that reflect our values, our personality and who we are, what drives us, where our passions are. Those are all things, both externally and internally, that create those values. So we know kind of where those values come from, but the next question is, why do our values matter? There's several reasons. I listed 3 here on this slide. You could, and there's a list of resources we'll share with you later, you can discover so many more. But knowing your values gives you the potential for leading a more fulfilled life. There's a lot of research on this, that values actually lead to making decisions that create a consistency and a congruity with who you are as a person. And so it just knowing those values leads you to that opportunity. Identifying shared values in a group also improves communication and connection for group members. So not only is there that personal individual benefit, but there's also that group and connection benefit. And this is true whether you're talking about a work group that you may be in, or even in making decisions and identifying shared values within your family. The final point that I put down there is that advocating from your values empowers your voice. And that's really what we're talking about today, is how values can be used to empower and amplify your voice when you're working with other people. So values really determine our goals in life, and they also determine the outcomes that we're going to get. Also, values impact our perceptions of situations. And someone else's values may impact their perceptions of us and the way we're reacting to situations. So there's an interesting dynamic there that we will touch on towards the end, but this dynamic between how personal values of individuals can impact group dynamics. So it's important to be able to identify your values. If you do a search online of value identification, you will come up with a list of various websites, lots of activities. There are a couple that Jana and I are going to share with you today, kind of to give you 2 different perspectives on how you can do this. But there are so many more. And again, there will be some resources that will help you. This is a pretty straightforward value identification activity. I'm going to walk through the directions, and then I'm actually going to show you an example. So the first step in this one is just to read through a list of values. You can, once again, you can find a list of values online. Read through a list of values and quickly identify the ones that resonate with you. Don't overthink it. Just identify the values that kind of resonate. Then you're going to take the values that you identified and group together any that are similar and connected. When you go through that first time, if you start out with a list of 50 values, there may be 25 or 30 that kind of resonate with you, but you can't have 25 or 30 core values, because if everything is important, nothing's important, right? So we want to work to get that list down. One way to do that is just by grouping together ones that are similar and connected. Try to narrow it down to about 5 groups if you can, but if you can't, don't worry. You can take care of that in the next step. And it's also okay if some of your groups only have 1 or 2 values in them. There may be one that just doesn't seem to have anything connected with another value, and that's fine too. So after you've got those groups, you're going to pick the value, one value from each of those groups that you think represents all of the words that are in that group for your core values. So let me walk you through an example. First of all, this is the download that will be available on the Parent Network website along with the recording. You'll see this. This walks you through those directions that I just shared. And then there's also a whole list of resources at the bottom. But I want you to see the core values list right here. So this is an example of a list. This is from James Clear's website. So from that list, I just selected some values: authenticity, adventure, boldness, compassion, creativity, learning, optimism, pleasure. The list is there. Went through just really quickly. Then I took that list, those values, and started dividing them up into groups. Put adventure, boldness, and determination together. Put creativity, fun, pleasure together. Created some lists that seemed to connect. If someone else took these values and grouped them, they might group them differently. They may not see justice and service as having a connection. So this is a very personal activity, no right or wrong answers. So from that list and those groups, I was able to get it into 5 groups. I then took and picked one word from each of those groups that really seemed to embody that group of words. So what I ended up with was adventure, learning, creativity, service, and compassion. Doing a values identification activity in this way is a wonderful first step in taking an idea that can be somewhat abstract and helping to make it more concrete so that you can begin to connect it to your life. However, even this may feel a little abstract because what you're doing is you're picking values that resonate with you, values that maybe you want, but may not be part of your life right now. So that's why in looking at your values, the next step, and some people may feel more comfortable even doing this activity first, is looking to see if values align with your life. Because we live, life generally is messy, right? It's quite often we will discover that something that value is not consistent with the way that we live. And that's not a bad thing. It's just a point of awareness for ourselves that maybe there's some disconnect. And most likely, I know for me, when that's happening, I feel it internally. I already know that that dissonance is there, that my actions are somewhat out of step with my values. If I know my values, I can probably easily identify where that disconnect and that dissonance is. If I don't know my values, it may be harder for me to make that connection with why I'm not feeling in line with the actions and the choices that I'm making. So there are some ways to determine if your values align with your life. You can look for ways that your actions match your stated values. For example, you can see that, well, so an example from our family, one of our values is adventure, and it is rare for us to have a weekend not doing something outdoors that is fairly adventurous. That is a way that we can very clearly see that those actions and those values are matched up. On the flip side, you can identify areas where your actions may be disconnected from your values. So to share another personal example, one of my values is fun. However, that is probably one of the values that I struggle most to prioritize because there's so much that needs to be done, right? And so this idea, I often notice a disconnect and a dissonance in my own life when that value has kind of gotten sidelined for maybe other things that I don't value, but feel important. And so those are conversations I have with myself regularly, how to manage that disconnect there. You can also watch for times when your actions may be unknowingly elevating unhealthy values. It's important to acknowledge that not everything that we value is healthy. The list of values that you're going to find online, those are healthy values for the most part. At least they have the potential to be implemented in our lives in a healthy way, right? However, there are some things that individuals and organizations will unknowingly value that creates unhealthy settings or situations that people have to deal with. So this idea that values and the way that they show up in our lives can be healthy or unhealthy is something that's important to recognize as well, both personally and when we're working with organizations and systems. I also want to point out that this idea of determining if your values are in line with your life isn't necessarily about change. Awareness is an incredibly powerful tool. Simply the act of acknowledging, wow, that action that I just did was not really in line with this value that I know I have. Okay. And then moving on. That can be very powerful. It's just bringing awareness to what's happening. So don't feel like if things are out of line that there needs to be change. Just open up the space and allow yourself the potential to be able to be aware of what is happening and ways where there may be a disconnection. Just because you're disconnected from something that you believe you value doesn't mean that you don't, that isn't actually a value in your life, right? There are a lot of forces at play that impact the way that we live out our lives and that we live out our values. And that's why in a little bit, we're going to talk about the whole decision-making piece and using our values in decision-making. Before we go into that though, Janet's going to walk through another activity that can help you kind of check for that value alignment and some questions that you can ask yourself to help with that.
Hey everyone. I'm going to apologize a little bit in advance if you see eye rolls or me looking to the side or hear some loud banging. We have construction going on here, so I apologize. And if it gets bad, I may just mute and let Jen take over. So once you take some time to think about what you think are the most important values to you, how do you know those are the values that really drive your actions in the moment? Being able to state what you value, as Jen was pointing out, doesn't always translate into those values showing up in your actions. So I started digging deeper into the value-based decisions that I was making. And I started to wonder why I frequently felt so emotional after a crisis event in my life, or even after a big decision that I really hadn't been looking forward to. Sometimes I felt shame, and I nearly always was disappointed. The next exercise that we're going to talk about helped me to figure out why my actions and what my actions revealed about my underlying values. Those that I hadn't pulled out of the list, because let's face it, we aren't going to knowingly pick out a quality we don't like out of a list of values, but that quality may be one that we don't like in ourselves. So this next little exercise is something that I found it really interesting and really important and helpful for me. It was just a way for me to look at not what values do I pick out of a list of values that almost everyone could agree on were all things that we would want in one degree or another. But what do my actions really reveal about what I value, particularly for me in those crisis moments? Because we all face those when we're raising our children that have serious emotional disturbance. So what you would do is pick a simple activity that you do frequently, like brushing your teeth, putting on your socks. For me, I picked going to work. It was something that I do every day during the week. It's something that I value. So I wanted to see what my decision-making was around going to work, because it also has a competing value with my family, which I also value as family time. So then ask yourself, what would have to happen for me not to do that activity, for me not to brush my teeth, for me not to go to work that day? And then, okay, so what would have to happen to make me go to work anyway? And then what would have to happen for me not to go to work anyway? And keep going back and forth with those questions until you can't go any further, until you hit the wall that says, there isn't anything that would make me change my mind. This is what I'm doing. For me, if I picked brushing my teeth, I would quickly learn that self-care ranks significantly lower on my list of values than compassion, contribution, or responsibility, because there's a lot that might make me miss brushing my teeth on a given day, until I started to suffer the embarrassment of bad breath, food in my teeth, or the ultimate crime, fuzzy teeth. Then there might not be anything that could keep me from the toothbrush, except maybe a friend in crisis. Then even teeth without brushing would have to wait. I found it far more revealing to find out what would keep me from my job, or what would keep me from date night. So this is an exercise you can do anytime, and Jen, you can change the slide there. It just moves us into the power of value-based decisions. When you really know what it is, when you've thought through the process of what it is that you value, what I found was that particularly in those moments of crisis, this was really helpful for me, and helpful for me not to come out of those crisis moments and ultimate decisions feeling the shame and disappointment. So we've all been, especially as parents of children with serious emotional disturbance, or parents of children with severe developmental needs, like I have one of both, or one of each. We've all been in a situation where we were in crisis, and we wouldn't want people looking through the window making a judgment on our parenting in that moment. Taking time to think about what you truly value when you're not in crisis, and how those values might impact your parenting in the crisis that eventually comes, can have a dramatic impact on how we respond in those crises. It helps us stay calm in the moment and be confident in our response, even looking back. Parenting our children, especially when their behaviors are far from the expected norm, is emotional for us. If we have already processed our values and thought about how we will respond in the crisis, we're more likely to be calm and happier with our actions in the moment, because they are more likely to align with our values. And if you find yourself feeling some shame or regret after the fact, then thinking through what felt important in that moment and how it does or doesn't align with your core values can be an important exercise to help you uncover a hidden value that may be influencing your actions. And I have found this to be the case so many times recently in just little things and big things that I had to do with caring for my daughter, who's completely nonverbal and has a lot of behavioral issues. And sometimes responding to those behavioral issues when you have something else that really needs to be done, particularly for her health or safety, it created a lot of conflict in me. So being able to go back and look at what I did and what was driving my actions in that moment really, really helped me. So it's something that I would just encourage everyone to take a few minutes and do, just think through, because I think it will really help in those moments where we wouldn't want somebody looking through the window judging our parenting. We're going to talk next about strategies for value-based advocacy. So in this section, we're going to talk about what you need to I can't read the slide anymore. Sorry, Jen. That's okay. Why you need to understand the values of other organizations, how you can discover the unstated values of organizations and individuals, and how you share the core values with a treatment team or a work group. So we're going to start expanding the idea from working and looking just at your own values to how does this impact when you're dealing in a team situation or a group situation. So you can go on to the next slide. When a group is trying to accomplish a task, it can be difficult to navigate personalities and group dynamics. Values, however, can bring people together. They're relatable, and typically people have major values in common. Understanding what values are driving perspectives of others in your group will help build understanding. For example, if you're in a group designing a bridge, the architect may be pushing the aesthetic, as it's a reflection of his design and he values achievement, boldness, and creativity. While the engineer is pushing for function because she values safety, knowledge, and success. Finally, the city manager may be arguing for the same old design to be used as every other bridge in the city because they value security, service, and fiscal management. Understanding how these values play into the various perspectives can help everyone come together on a design that meets all of the values in varying degrees. And if they can agree up front on their shared values, the ones that are most important to the project as a whole, then the outcome will be improved and the process far more productive. I'm going to turn it back over to Jen now because it's getting loud.
Thanks, Janet. We're going to talk, we'll end today by talking about some practical strategies for using values within both treatment advocacy for your kiddos, and then as well as any system or organizational work that you may do. Before we do that, I want to pause for a second. The Q&A feature is at the top, and if you have questions, if you have comments, please feel free to use that. We'll come back to those questions. We'll also answer those in, as we can come back to them at the end, we can answer them right now, but don't hesitate to use that feature kind of as we're moving forward with this. The next question I have, Janet mentioned hidden values, right? We talked about how values can be healthy and unhealthy. They can also be hidden values and stated values. And again, hidden values aren't necessarily bad. We just want to be able to uncover them, because a hidden value, we can't leverage a hidden value and use it in a positive way. We can't use it in powerful decision making or use it in elevating our voice. We need to kind of be able to identify those values in order to use them. So in your thinking, we want to maybe use the chat feature for this one, just so it may be easier than the Q&A. But I would love to, sorry guys, I've got too many things open. I would love to hear from you where you can find, in your experience, where have you been able to find stated system and organizational values? Where are places that you might discover those? Thinking about organizations you work with, schools your children attend, businesses that you interact with. So Tricia said the mission statement, absolutely. I am currently sitting in a room that is used as a board meeting room for one of our local boards. And it was interesting when I walked in, I've been in this room many times over the years, but I just noticed that they have their board mission statement, and immediately underneath it, they actually have a list of 6 values, right? That are their board values. So it's stated, it's there, it's on the wall where they meet. The About Us section on the website, someone else said, that's absolutely true. If you look at websites, you can find that information. More and more organizations are trying to be explicit with sharing their values. Within the YES system of care, the values are found in the principles of care. So that's another place where you might be able to find those values that are kind of explicitly stated. With that, thanks guys, I appreciate your interaction. With that, those are the stated values, right? We can find those, we want to look for those. You can always ask if someone, if they seem to be hard to find. But we also want to discover the unstated values, because sometimes, even though the unstated values can't be used as powerfully in a positive way, sometimes they're hindering moving forward. Not because they're necessarily bad, but because we may not know that they are a driving force in what's happening, or what in what someone else or another organization is doing. So how do we find those unstated values? One thing that you can do is just listen with curiosity, really active listening. It's easy to sit in a meeting and start to get frustrated, to begin to kind of feel, I can feel myself kind of emotionally pushing back on sometimes things that are said, instead of really stopping and listening with curiosity about what is being said and what values may be driving what's being said. So it's a kind of active listening that is really driven by curiosity. The other thing you can do is you can look at actions and behaviors, because the reality is our values are what drive our actions and behaviors. And that's true for individuals, it's true for families, and it's true for organizations. So if you're struggling to figure out what the values are, or you feel like there may be some unstated values, look at those actions that you can see and try to extrapolate from those the values that may be the driving force.
And I wanted to add something real quick to what you were saying there, is that there are times when you see someone's actions and it's being driven by something that they feel is maybe more urgent, like maybe their boss just came down on them about financial something or something like that. And so when they come into that next meeting, that's where their whole, like their values are kind of usurped by this other thing. And knowing what their core values are frequently allows you to open up a conversation where you can turn them back into making decisions from their core values, rather than this thing that has rather usurped it at the time. I think we've all been in situations where something that we're thinking about or something that's happened has usurped where we are in the moment and what we really truly value. So that's just a tip.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's exactly right. It goes back a little bit to what I talked about in the beginning with those times when our values aren't in alignment, right? If you see somebody else's values not in alignment with what you have seen their values to be in the past, more than likely it's that urgent piece that's kind of been something that's been thrust on them that's kind of triggering that. So that's definitely one of the powerful pieces about being familiar with values and being able to do that. It's a great comment. The last thing on this slide is just that advocacy is easier when a higher number of core values are held in common. So one example, there's a lot of pieces to think about with this. I think it could apply in a lot of situations. One that I see often with parents is related to school choices, right? So parents who are raising kids with special needs often really struggle when it comes to working with the school and helping to make positive decisions and kind of move things forward. What I've discovered as I've watched parents over the years is that when a parent is working with a school that shares the values that they have, it tends to be much smoother than when they are working with a school that has a different set of values. Maybe a school that doesn't value individuality as much, that really doesn't have that capacity. That's not where their mission is. And so I think that just the school example is such a great one for seeing that this advocacy is easier. Doesn't mean we should always try to make it easier, right? I mean, sometimes advocacy is just hard. Advocating for our kids is hard, advocating for systems is hard. But when we are wanting something easier, right? If you want a school where you're not having to fight all the time and you have the ability, you live someplace, unlike me, where you can choose a different school, finding something that's got more core values is going to make that journey easier. So I think that that's just a practical tip that can be helpful when trying to navigate this. We're going to talk about sharing core values on the treatment side, and then we'll talk about kind of the system side. I say often that I believe the treatment work should mirror the system work and vice versa. So the reality is these can look very similar and there's a lot of crossover, but we did try to pull out some practical tips for you because ultimately that's what we want. We want this to be just a super practical and relevant conversation for you today. So when you're in a treatment team meeting and you've already identified your core values, right? You know individually and maybe even as a family what your core values are internally. But you're working with a treatment team and you need that treatment team to know what those values are. There are multiple advantages to having them know values. Janet covered a lot of those. The crisis piece to me is such a powerful one, in that if your treatment team knows your core values and you're trying to make a decision about services and they're looking at those core values and they're aware of those, that's going to help with making that decision. Your values almost are able to be that voice, definitely amplify your voice when you may not be able to state it, especially if you're dealing with a crisis, right? So many times in crisis, we just tend to struggle to communicate. And so having these values as part of your treatment team's understanding of who your family is can be really valuable. Ways to communicate that to them. One is just to use the CANs. Most of us in Idaho, hopefully everybody is familiar with the Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths tool, and it is at its core a communication tool, right? That's what it is, especially when we get to treatment planning. It is intended to communicate what's happening with the child, to take that story and to put it in something that gives some numbers so that we can chart progress and we can figure out how to manage that treatment in a way that's truly supportive. In the CANs, often values are going to be displayed through strengths. So if you're looking at your child's strengths section, you may be able to pull some values out of that. You might even be able to pull some values that your child has out of that. But you definitely, especially with younger kids, you're going to see some family values. Whether we're talking about faith and your connection to a faith community or outside activities, all of those things are listed and have the potential to be listed in that strengths section. So that's one way that you could communicate your family's core values to the team. Another one is to tell a story that reflects your values in action. I love this idea. I believe that stories are really powerful and they share pieces of our life in ways that are otherwise missed. So the way this would work is maybe you're wanting to communicate that your family value, I'll use my family, right? We love to be outside. That is a high value for our family. So telling a story about an experience that we had outside is going to help make that value more concrete for a team. And it also would highlight other values that we have as a result of that. right? So sharing a story that you feel like really articulates who your family is will help connect that and make it more concrete for others that you're working with. The other thing to do is just write those values. If you know what your values are, you can name off your 5 family values, put those on documents and emails, right? Ask that they be listed on the agenda so that they are there and people see them. Just like, you know, boards may list their values on the wall and organizations may list them on websites. You can put them on the agenda. Having something in writing and in front of people is powerful. And if that's what you want people to keep in mind when they're working with your family, put them out there. So the next slide is talking about using values to advocate in a work group. So this is the system side of that. Like I said, there's a lot of crossover. Putting values of a work group on the agenda would also be a very powerful and practical tool, right? Telling a story about a family that has experienced the system positively related to what you're doing in a work group, you could do that too. Lots of crossover. But the piece that I really wanted to point out that I think, and there's so much discussion that we could have around this, but what I want to point out when it comes to advocating in a work group is the idea of those shared values, right? Shared values are where the power is when it comes to working together with people that come from different perspectives, have different experiences, and are, because of that and because of those external factors and internal factors, are going to have different values. However, as humans, there are shared values, and you can once again find research on those. There are shared values that we have with each other. Additionally, there are also shared values within this work that we do, right? The professionals that go into a career supporting families that are struggling with mental health issues typically have a certain set of values. Organizations typically have a certain set of values. And if we can work to advocate from that place of those shared values, that's where that power is going to lie. So the example here that I shared is just, you know, a parent may have a value of humor, simplicity, fairness, resilience, and safety. An organization may have values of service, innovation, stability, resilience, and safety, right? If you're in a work group meeting and you're trying to come to a decision about a new program or talk about a program that's not working, or a different way to approach a situation, focusing on those shared values, which in this example would be resilience and safety, that is what's going to move the conversation further along. If a parent gets stuck talking about simplicity or fairness, well, those are very important values and definitely should be considered. If you get stuck there, that voice is not going to be heard, at least not for very long. Right? Shifting over to that place of shared values, you don't even have to stay there, but if you shift over to that place, then you begin to get some forward movement within the conversation. Same thing on the organization side, right? If the organization talks all about stability and the parents are just saying that this program is not working, we need something that actually meets the needs of kids, we're going to have a disconnect. But if we can find that common ground, and have a conversation in that place of mutual understanding and agreement, we begin to move forward.
And Jen, sometimes too, the work that you're talking about, these are things that when you're talking about global advocating, like advocating at a system level, that's true. But it's also true that as parents, we do the same advocating for our children all day, every day. We do it in the schools, we do it in the juvenile justice system, we do it when we're meeting with a provider and resolving disconnects or trying to get everyone on the same team. So this is something that the value-based advocacy that we're talking about is something that you can use really in every aspect with your child's life.
Yeah, absolutely. With that, there was a question, and I'm just going to read it. So wondering if you can do the value identification activity with your child to help your child identify their values so they can start to align their actions with their values. Absolutely. And there are a couple of examples in the resources on that download that provide some ideas for that, for specific activities that can be used with I think the one that we listed, maybe one was middle school, and it seemed like we found another one that was kind of a little more high school or young adult. But you can even use these with younger children. There are a lot of value identification programs out there to help them be able to see that and make that connection. I think one of the things that is so interesting about this is all of the programs that we found, they were using value identification within treatment settings. So they were actually using the idea of connecting your values to your actions and behaviors to help teenagers that were struggling with some behavior modification challenges. So this is absolutely something that can be used with all of our kids, developmentally, just make it fit where they are in their developmental stage. But it can be really powerful for teenagers that are struggling with kind of that behavior modification piece, because it connects their behaviors to those values. Thanks for asking the question. That was a great one. So we'll definitely wait a second to see if there are any other questions. So if you have other questions, pop them in the Q&A box. But we'll end with this quote. When your values are clear to you, making decisions becomes easier. And I think that's just a great, succinct way to put it. And like Janet said, it applies just in so many areas of life. Okay, I'm looking.
Somebody commented, don't be afraid to tell people what you value. I agree. I think that's a super important thing. If you know what it is that you value, and here comes the noise, if you know what it is you value, then stating that not only helps other people, it helps you.
You're good. Yeah, absolutely. Don't be afraid to say that. We need to have more conversations about values, both individually and within our families and just within our communities. Because I think the thing that we will discover is that we have more in common than not. And by focusing on those values, we begin to see those things, and we're able to kind of identify the commonalities that we have. At the same time, identifying values really honors and respects the differences that we have. And that can be really powerful within a family, to be able to recognize those. So just so much here. The value identification activity, I will say, if you haven't done something like that before, it's worth it to take some time to dig into that and to spend, a good 30 minutes kind of working through some of that and asking yourself some questions about it. Then walk away from it, share it with someone else. There's a lot of conversation that can be had. So. And I'm looking at this other. So we also had a comment, it's okay to tell the team that your values differ from your children, and somehow we need to incorporate both parent and child values in the treatment plan. And that's true, especially as our kiddos get older, their values do start to, while family and culture impacts values, that individual piece is important, and we want to honor that. And so there will be differences in those values. Learning how to manage those is part of why you want a treatment team, right? So that's a great point. Well, guys, Janet and I enjoyed being with you today. I want to thank you so much just for your interaction and just feedback with us. That was super helpful. Feel free to reach out to either of us with questions or more comments. Definitely download the resource page and go on your own search. There's a ton of great information out there. But I hope this is helpful and just kind of a grounding place for you to start as we head into the fall and winter.
Thanks, everyone.